talking well. Good? Good morning. Top off your coffee mug and find a seat, either here in the Great Hall or in your very own living room, however you're joining us this morning. I'm pretty happy about what's about to happen. Hal Crenshaw and Bill Craddock, I don't know if they're going to talk about favorite definitions of poetry, but on my wall in my office, when our daughter Kate kind of started getting into calligraphy, one birthday or something, she was always giving us a piece of paper with something calligraphy on it. She wrote out my favorite definition of poetry, which is by Leonard Cohen. Y'all know Leonard Cohen? He would usually sing his poems. Leonard Cohen said, if your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash. And when I think of these two guys, it's a long, deep friendship, and poetry has kind of been the ash, maybe, as it's burning well. If you have a well-tended fire, you guys know about fires, you well-tend that fire. So I don't know how many years you've been friends, but we'll find out soon. I know that you've been Baguette brothers for several decades, which means every Thursday morning with a group of people, they were considering the poetry and the prose of Scripture together in community. So Bill and Hal are going to take us a little bit into their story with poetry, how it matters to their lives and might matter to ours, maybe in unexpected ways. So welcome, guys. Take it away.
Thanks, Scott. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Let me counter that. I don't think, to me, poetry is not the ash, but the fire. And it's the fire that sparks, that makes life worth living. When Scott asked me to join Hal, who is really the real deal in terms of poetry, I quickly accepted with naive enthusiasm and dangerous curiosity, knowing that I'm not a poet really, but I occasionally get drawn to it. And poetry to me is kind of like music and art. All three of those areas of life somehow or another provide a spark occasionally. And what's paradoxical about poetry is it's with words. Music and art is more of an expression of a mood, of a feeling, but poetry is even more challenging in some ways than art and music, because you're dealing with words which seem to capture and domesticate and then contain a thought rather than release it. So how do you do that? So I'm going to ask Hal, how did you get started? What was your first brush with poetry?
My first brush, I was at school at Memphis University School, and nobody would be the editor of the poetry magazine, lovely, called The Muse, very appropriate name. So I was appointed, and I wrote a 6-line poem, and that was the first time and only time I've ever been published. I published my 6 lines. The Savage is Within Me was the name of it. And so that was where I was with poetry. And then fast forward from 17 years old to 48 years old. And it's very interesting that you use the word fire and ash, because my experience to get with poetry, Brene Brown would love this when you make yourself vulnerable, but my brush with it was I had a tremendous illness, and it was, nobody could figure out what it was, and it went on. That was 18 years ago, and in the process, I burned. It's actually what it finally got diagnosed with is called man on fire syndrome, and it is a genetic defect where pain is out of control. It's also untreatable. I'm not going to talk anymore about this after this one thing, but man on fire and burning, and then the ash. And what happened was not that I read poetry and found it that way. I actually emoted poetry, and I look back on it and say, what in the world was he writing? What was he saying? But that's where it came from. And Jim Boyd, who's a member here, led me somehow to start really studying poetry. And I ended up getting a degree, MFA, and then I fell in love with reading poetry and poets. And the good news is today, the burning's not nearly as bad most of the time. And that's how I got here.
So this is going to be a casual conversation, and we'll hopefully riff and ask you to also join in as we discuss poetry. And, you know, sometimes when I think of poetry, at least in my first experience, where you have to memorize in 5th, 6th grade, by the shores of Gitche Gumi, you know, sort of shining sea and Nokomis, the old woman pointing westward. That's about it. I don't remember much more. But as Hal said, as we grow older, we become more respectful to the beauty, and you have to dig in to really understand poetry. And frankly, I was talking to Suzanne Henley on Monday, and I said, "What makes poetry so difficult?" And she said, "The New Yorker." It is sometimes like you need a air hammer to break the concrete to really understand what this poet's doing. Why are some of them so abstruse, so hard to understand? And yet, when they are unfolded, there's some real power in the poetry underneath. Particularly, and you mentioned read poetry. I don't think the word read is exactly the right word, Hal. Isn't it more of an experience? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think that the way, the way you approach, everybody approaches a poem differently, and everybody likes something about it differently. Some people want to, like Billy Collins say, they want to sit in a chair and whip the meaning out of it. You know, just beat it up and try to figure it out. The meaning is so important. Other people really get into the poet's life and the story. And they want to know all about what happened with Emily Dickinson or John Keats. People are attracted to the musicality of the poetry. I can go on and on about all that. But when I look at a poem, first I'm trying to figure out, does it look good on the page? And second, I ask, who is the speaker? Is it speaking to me? And then I go to whether I get meaning out of it.
Yeah, well, you wonder why poetry? Why is it important? In some ways, it's a way we can kind of nestle up or get close to the divine, a way to really understand the truth with a capital T or whatever we call. And it sparks your imagination. There's a poem, there's a prayer in the Common Book of the Book of Common Prayer that says, "Eternal God, so draw my heart, so fill my imagination." And in some ways, good poetry can allow us to not just wrestle, but free up our imagination in wonderful ways. And we think about that. I think the next slide. Wallace Stevens, who I think was an insurance salesman at one point, one of the great poets, and his definition of poetry was, the poet is the priest of the invisible. What does that mean, Hal?
Not much poetry is written while one is in community. Most people that I know that write poems and whatever, it comes from usually an interior place. Poets often have to go do a deep dive into themselves. And I think that's exactly what he's talking about. Mm.
Well, I was fumbling around the internet and came across a wonderful definition of poetry by, see if we can do this. There we go. Emily Dickinson. You've heard of Emily Dickinson? I think she wrote most of her poems up in her second floor looking out the window. And is it true that most of it wasn't published until after she died? Yeah. But her definition of poetry was, if I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. That gives me goosebumps. Even at my old age, I have an appetite for wonder, for the wowness of life. And poetry can provide that, wow, look at that. It's an amazement that sometimes we're so dulled with with the quotidian, the everyday lives that we have, that we don't allow ourselves to wonder, to really get excited about stuff. And I think Dickinson captures this well. What do you think, Hal?
I think she captures it well. I love one line in her poems. It says, tell the truth. She's talking about poetry. Tell the truth, but tell it slant. And how many of you really have a hard time and say, I don't get poetry. I just don't get it. You know, there are so many people in this world that really don't get it. And it's because it takes a little work, I think, to go to that spot. You know, my favorite definition on poetry is it's compression of language, expansion of thought. And every word usually matters in a poem. Not that you can't have a lot of words that put a lot of air in a poem, but the reality is you're kind of dealing with essence. But anyway, anybody reads a poem, and any two people are going to be like snowflakes. They're not going to look like, you're not going to get the same thing out of them, but you're going to get something out of them.
Yeah, there's another quote that says that the relationship of poems to what we intuit but can never fully say makes them like prayer. That unending effort to bring someone closer to the divine without pretending the divine could ever be fully known or understood. I think that's a way of looking at it too.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Yeah, when we were charged with the Sunday school class, it was talk about how poetry is necessary now, is needed now in this world of ours.
Well, that's a big question. It could be answered a lot of different ways. But look around us. Sometimes we're so involved with this consumer world or with the activity, the overstimulated life of the social media and news. Perhaps poetry gives us a chance to be still and know that I am God. You remember that in Psalms. But a way to check in with yourself, with a sense of relationship with God and with others is poetry. I have a couple of books by Rumi and Rilke on my chair in my little converted bedroom into a study. And it has each day these poems by Rumi and Rilke, and some of them, they just don't ring with me, but others give me that wowness that I really hunger for, like a deer yearns for the water. So poetry is a way of getting closer to the divine, is what I said to me. And it's interesting, Hal and I were thinking about when did poetry begin, and what makes a lot of sense is that before written language, before poetry was written, people remembered things through songs. Just like we are surprised sometimes when we hear on the 1950s or 1960s music, you can remember the words because you can remember the song, and the rhythm of the song brings back the rhythm of the words. And that's the way it was carried forward since the Bronze Age, particularly the Psalms. And we thought we'd talk a little bit about Psalms. The Hebrew word for psalm is mizan, which means songs. But people remembered and carried on traditions through songs. And Hal, tell us a little bit about the Psalms.
Well,
the big picture, and then we'll take this
Psalms,
one quote.
Psalms were written way before David. Well, they weren't written, they were sung. And they came forward, but David, which I guess was in the 6th century BC.
David was 1000 BC.
1000 BC, yeah. Okay. The temple
I just looked that up
today.
Okay,
the temple was destroyed in five something. And about the poems, they say, have more authors than any other book in the Bible. David is thought to have written 50 of them. Solomon 1, Ezra 1. The other ones are fairly unattributable. And I just learned all this yesterday, but it's fascinating. They're there's basically three kinds of psalms. There's psalms of lamentation, which really do deal with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. There are poems of thanksgiving, and then there are royal psalms, which address the king. And in Christianity, often that, like in Hebrews, the king would be the Messiah. In Judaism, the king would have been the king. It wouldn't have been the Messiah. They speak deeply to us from a poetic perspective. They're poetry, and they're some of our earliest poetry. But it's not going to be poetry that you can go like you did in high school and try to scansion, to try to figure out the foot and the meter and have iambic pentameter, all that. It's not going to work. What holds them together in English, and remember they weren't written in English, but what holds them together for us is something called parallelism. And there'll be a statement made, and then it'll be followed by a different way of saying the same thing, and which kind of holds it all together for us. You want to read the...
Yeah, well, let me make a couple of comments. I really like the way Calvary handles psalms with the singing, particularly the choir. I can't sing along, but the chants are just captivating. And I like that. And also, I remember going to a monastery up in New England and listening to the monks reading the Psalms, where they hesitate, where that little asterisk is, they hesitate, and you take a deep breath, and then you move forward. That pause is just, it makes a lot of noise in my heart to use a slower pace. And when you read a poem, any poem, perhaps you ought to slow down and take a deep breath between one thought and another, just to let it sink in. So it's very important. In the Psalms, what I discovered in reading about it earlier this week is that they weren't written until around, actually written down until around 600 BC and codified or anthologized is the word, right? Around 500 BC into 150 Psalms to copy the Judaic tradition in the books of Moses. And it's interesting that there are 150 and they're set up on a triennium. So there are 50, there's one for almost every week that they could use. And the temple in Israel, actually, this was their liturgy, was in the Judaic tradition, is to read the Psalms. And it is our liturgy today. It's a very powerful thing. I encourage you sometime just to go. Robert Alter has a book called The Book of Psalms that he really takes on, and it's very, very interesting to read about that. Do you want to take this one on?
Yeah, I'll just read it out of my Bible. So this is Psalms 40, 1 through 3. And this is a psalm attributed to David. And the first part of this psalm is a psalm of thanksgiving. What's really, and I picked this psalm because this psalm speaks to me at the deepest level. I could read this psalm and I found something so far beyond any peace I had known with my life journey when I read it. So here it is. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. David was at a life-changing moment here. He went to a place where he had tremendous patience, he had tremendous hope, and he was answered, and he was placed on a rock. He was no longer in the miry pit. He was brought up out of the pit of destruction. So I think the part about not just this, there's several books of poetry in the Bible. The Psalms is our main one, Ecclesiastes, Job, and the Song of Solomon. There might be more. But those books move to me over to more like what John is in the Gospels. They're not Luke. They're not this doctor direct, give me an answer, kind of an engineer, mathematician, blah, blah, blah. It's that part that pulls us to something unknown inside of ourselves, to maybe the unknowable. And that's why I think they're so important for all of us, because it gets us to the gray in life. It's not black or white. When you're here, you're in the gray of life.
You know, last Wednesday, Stephanie Speller was speaking to us, and I think those on video now can actually look it up, and I'd like for you to listen to what she said, but she wrote a book called Cracking the Church? The Church Cracked Open. And what she was saying to me was what the Psalms are saying to me, is we need to crack open our institutions and see the Spirit within. And we need to crack open our hearts and see life again and again and again. It's a renewal process. We'll never get it right. But I think you're right that we do live in a gray area, and I think we ought to be careful about any certainties and any answers. Rachel Raymond, one of my favorite quotes from her, and I think Suzanne Henley has it on a wall in her dining room, is that her aim in life is to pursue unanswerable questions in good company. That could be a great creed for the Episcopal Church. I'd like to move on if we could.
Go ahead. Well, I wanted to read one thing. You're talking about no certainties in life. The only certainty I have for sure is that I torture my wife reading her my poetry. Sorry, Lucia, but I'm going to keep doing it. There's one other one I want to read that's not.
Okay.
And this is when, Job has got his three friends that are telling him all this stuff. And then Job gets talked to by God. And God doesn't really directly talk like this a lot in the Bible. But this is poetry too, and it's a little different take. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set the measurements, since you know, or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk?" And that's straight out poetry, and to me it matches a lot of the Psalms. But it is why we need poetry, and why we need our faith in the Bible, is that's the direction that can take us way beyond watching pro sports or whatever it is we spend our time doing.
Very good, very strong. We just selected, how many poems did we look at? I don't know, a bunch of them, but we narrowed it down, and we came up with guess you wouldn't call this a real haiku, which is 7 syllables, 5 syllables, and 7 syllables. Anyway, it is a haiku because Masahide was a Japanese poet and a samurai, and studying under another Japanese haikuist. Is that what you call it? Someone who writes, named Basho. But this particular one, I think, is a great example of the power of poetry, because it starts with barns burnt down. Now I can see the moon. Each one of those words you can unpack for a day and try to figure out. The barn. Whose barn? My barn? What's a barn? Life? Is it all the trappings of life? How does that work? Or our country? How are we going to deal with this? Each one of these words, and even the word now, how often do we try to avoid living in the present? I mean, we've got to stop and be aware of being in the presence of God, in the presence of others. Now is a very powerful word. Nowness is a state of mind, and in some ways, it's where we ought to be, and most of the time we're not. The moon. Tell them about the moon.
So, haiku is this, you ask what you call them when they write them. I think you call them a haiku.
Haiku.
It's a very tight way of writing, but this is a true expression here of this definition, compression of language, expansion of thought. If you're right now in the Ukraine, you're a Ukrainian living in the city and everything around you is being burned down, where do you find hope? You could just have lamentations, you could have despair. But this, if you carry this with you, when it's all torn down, I had a friend, Harriet's friend too, a fox hunter from down on the coast when Katrina hit and they lost everything they had in the house. And the house too, it floated away. And when I saw him, it was 2 weeks after, and he and his wife, and they had a suitcase and a small box, and those were their worldly possessions at that time. He said he'd never been happier. 2 years later, he had the house and everything back again. But the point is, where do you find hope? And this is one of the most hopeful poems, because when it's all gone, there's that clarity, and there's that vision, and there's that moon.
Yeah. Yesterday I was looking at the New York Times magazine, and Scott, would you like to take this on and read it and tell them about this poet?
Well, sure. Well, Bill handed me this right before, but this happens to be a poet I know of. Well, I'll read it. Should I read it? This was printed in the New York Times Magazine by Ilya Kaminsky. Ilya Kaminsky is the poet. He's Eastern European, and I'm trying to remember if it's what of the Eastern Bloc countries he's from. If you ever look him up, we've actually wondered about bringing him here sometime. He's a person of faith. He's deaf. And so when you hear him read and see him read, it's as though sounds are coming from different parts of the person, like whales are helping communicate. I mean that in a very complex, and he rocks. And anyway, it's a very embodied experience, and you're going to get way less of that. But from me. But it's called "We Lived Happily During the War," and I think I thought about it as well when you were talking about why might it matter right now, and you mentioned Ukraine. So this was not just written in the last few weeks. It was a few years ago. We lived happily during the war. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war.
I can't respond. It's very powerful.
It's interesting to read it right on the heels of this one that holds together great loss and tragedy and great beauty at the same time. But this one takes us to a little darker place that probably unsettles our comfort a little bit. Is some of our happiness based on not paying attention, not thinking about what's, I don't know, how would you...
Yeah, I read it yesterday at around 5:30 with a Saturday night cocktail. And And I was sitting next to my daughter, Macy, and I had her read it. And then I looked out in the yard, snow is still there, and nice, warm, cozy house, living happily. And thinking of that parenthetical expression, forgive us. It was just very powerful that sometimes we catch ourselves in this happy state, worried about it, engaged with our first world problems, and we try to avoid, or the default is to be happy rather than to be in love with the world in a broader way. So it was very powerful.
You know, he just said, I can't speak, I can't. And that's Emily Dickinson. When it blows the top off your head. That's the other thing about poetry. I mean, how many of you have had it happen when you're in church and this gorgeous choir, gorgeous soprano, whatever, hits this note and your eyes water and your throat gets a lump in it and you have no idea why? Raise your hand, because that's what can happen with Scott. And poetry means that much to him. It's beyond a hobby, and for Bill to have that kind of reaction, and you got to look deeply, and that's why we really do need poetry. You know, there's corporate poetry that helps our world, but there's this other poetry that speaks to our insides. You pay attention when you get that feeling. There are a couple of poems I cannot read them without just completely choking up, and I have no idea why. But I put one of them in here, this Crossing the Bar, about Alfred Lloyd Tennyson, and I would try to read it, but I'll choke up at the same spot every time. And same way with When You're Old by William Butler Yeats. There's something there that demands attention, that feels something that I don't even know what it is.
Well, we selected one poem to crack open, and I think you have it in the handout, and it's, this is not working. I'm sorry, Robin. And it starts, think in ways you've never thought before. Hal, would you like to read that?
No, you read
No.
it.
Okay.
Here you go.
Okay. Robert Bly. Think in ways you've never thought before. If the phone rings, think of it as carrying a message larger than anything you've ever heard, vaster than 100 lines in Yeats. Think that someone may bring a bear to your door, maybe wounded and deranged. Or think that a moose has risen out of the lake and he's carrying on his antlers a child of your own whom you've never seen. When someone knocks on the door, think that he's about to give you something large, tell you you're forgiven, or that it's not necessary to work all the time, or that it's been decided that if you lie down, no one will die, or that it's been decided if you lie down, no one will die. You want to open this up to the group and see what you think about this, and what you think about this, or how you feel about this, or where are your emotions in this?
The first time I read this poem, I just burst into tears. You know, we had 3 children in rapid succession, but I had a miscarriage in there. And when they talked about coming out and having the baby that you never knew, I just never seen that written down.
Wow. Thank you.
The moose rising out of the lake with a child. So concrete and impossible and clear. Wow, that's beautiful. Anybody else have connections?
Thank you. It was the last line here where it says, or that it's been decided that if you lie down, no one will die. there have been so many times in my life when I've had a completely exaggerated opinion of my self-importance that I thought if I stopped, the world would stop, seriously. I mean, it's hard to admit that, but I did that, and I felt that. And this reminds me that what I need to do is to look at how I can fit in and take a breath and rest.
I love "it has been decided." I don't know. I love framing it. It's been decided. If you lie down, no one will die. It's a Sabbath kind of poem, maybe. What else? Yeah, Rosie.
I guess I wish I could put it into words. I think that's what poetry is to me. It's just kind of, it's out there and I'm trying to grab it. But it's something about what you were just saying, if I lie down and being humble. In my current profession, that's what I'm seeing over and over and over again. Like, this bear is brought to my door. And I'm like, holy heck, what am I doing with this thing? And I don't really want to open that door, but I've got to open that door, but I really don't want to open that door, and I've really got to talk to this bear. It's this conversation I have with myself. And then I have to kind of talk myself down and say, the bear has something to say to you. Let's listen. And what you were saying about laying down, it's just like, just take it. Just let's listen.
I love that this one does have some really good advice that we resonated with at the end, but only by bringing us a wounded or deranged bear, a moose rising out of the lake, a telephone ringing, like very, very concrete things. It's really interesting how poems aren't just about ideas, things to think about. Anybody else on this one?
Well, when you think of things that are concrete, good poetry perhaps offers a concrete image, and then it's unpacked or taken apart in a way that you're thinking about it as this poem starts, thinking about it in a different way, cracking it open. And I think that's true. There's a poem in here. Can we move to another?
How are we doing on time?
I think we got about 10, 15 minutes. Or we could open up for questions. What?
Yeah, just do another one.
I like the Seamus Haney poem that is the very beginning, Miracle.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it? I like them all, but...
Miracle. Not the one who takes up his bed and walks, but the ones who have known him all along and carry him in. Their shoulders numb, the ache and stoop, deep locked in their backs, the stretcher handles slippery with sweat, and no let up until he's strapped on tight, made tiltable and raised to the tile roof, then lowered for healing. Be mindful of them as they stand and wait for the burn of the paid-out ropes to cool, their slight lightheadedness and credulity to pass, those who had known him all along.
When you read a poem like that, you can actually experience these images, the rope burning, lowering down, the tilting. It's almost as if you're invited into the experience. So you're not reading it as an observer, you're actually participating in the story. And of course we know the story, and we also remember, rise up, take your mat and walk, is your sins are forgiven, walk. That's what we've been focused on. But here the focus is on the four friends who've known him all along, who actually take him up on the roof and lower him down. In some ways, to me, and I think everyone has a different perspective of this, it's like we are who we are related to. It's Ubuntu. I am because you are. relational ontology. We are a being. We are only, our identity is only, can only be expressed through a relationship. And in some ways, our relationship with others is where we see the face of God. That's where we see life, is in those relationships. Those 4 people, 4 men, I assume, who carried him up there in ropes burning, and they've known him all along. That's very powerful to me. That's the way I experience it. How about you, Hal?
Yeah, I think that we don't have time to go there, but we've all heard before about the language of God being the language of paradox, that there's this huge tension that goes on in life between things being the way we'd like to have them and maybe things being the way they are. You know, an everyday example that I run to is down at the farm. If there are too many deer, they depopulate themselves, they get disease. Wild turkeys do the same, they get something called blackhead. And if there are too many, they die. And that's a huge paradox, because life is created, and then life can, and we can find this all over. And there's this book I'd recommend. It's not poetry, but Lord, it is poetry. It's Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez. It's all about the Arctic Circle. But I want to, it's a little bit long, but I want to read what he writes about this. He said, "No culture has yet solved the dilemma that each has faced with the growth of the conscious mind. How to live a moral and compassionate existence when one is fully aware of the blood, the horror inherent in all life, when one finds darkness not only in one's own culture, but within oneself. If there is a stage at which an individual life truly becomes adult, it must be when one grasps the irony of its unfolding and accepts responsibility for a life lived in the midst of such paradox. One must live in the middle of contradiction, because if all contradiction were eliminated at once, life would collapse. There are simply no answers to some of the great pressing questions. You continue to live them out, making your life a worthy expression of a leaning into the light."
Very powerful. We have about 10 minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question, Robin, you've got your hand up. Oh.
I have a question from Missy Edmondson Cooper, who says she's a friend of Bill's. She says, all of these poems seem to point to our existential conundrum. We are where we should be, yet we hope or long for more. How do we reconcile the conflict, poetically speaking?
We're pursuing unanswerable questions in good company. I think that's the context of life. It's the rich, fertile part of life. To me, it's all about the relationships, as you said, with the deer and the turkey and the good, the evil. It's not just grayness we live in. I think we live in a technicolor world, but there's no answer. I can't answer, Missy. I'm sorry. Great question. Existential conundrums is pretty powerful stuff, you know.
Well, what if right here in this moment is an ambiguous place? So to be fully present is to be present to a lot of possibilities and things we're not going to ever quite grasp. I like that idea that poems always point beyond themselves. You never get a sense that it's... There's another Seamus Heaney poem where he talks about this miracle that happens and we dissipated it into news, he said. Poetry's not news. It's not like this account of something that happened. You get a sense, we kind of got it. So maybe that's a piece of it, like if where we are right now, being present to it means being present to some ambiguity and uncertainty and paradox.
And there's no way out of it except hope. I mean,
Yeah.
That's what these poems were doing, I think. It's like Rumi's Guest House, which I think Robert Bly kind of paralleled his poem to that, which is, Rumi says, the guest house, answer the door to whatever's there, because it might bring some, what do they call it, some new wonder into your life. That's a bad example, bad paraphrase of it, but
Yeah.
In some ways, maybe I'm a little naively enthusiastic, dangerously curious, but in some ways, the subtext is joy. If we experience wonder, there's a joy there, even in the darkest shadows. And in some ways, hope is fueled by joy. And to live with joy is to say, aha, wow, look at that. One of my favorite comments to another group was what I call the Goldfish Theory. I don't know if you've heard of that or not. There are two kinds of goldfish. One kind of goldfish eats, sleeps, swims around the bowl. And the other kind of goldfish has a 2-second memory, but every time around the bowl, it's, wow, look at that. Wow, wow, look at that.
I think Ted Lasso agrees with you.
Yeah, wow, look at that. And, you know, sometimes in life you look back on the year and you say, wow, remember that, wow. In some ways, poetry gives me the wowness that I need to move on.
Well, it makes me think, though, too, there are poems of lament that I don't think are counter to joy. It feels like the joy has to be there admitting that the barn's burned down.
Right, right.
So there's something in poetry, maybe that's the paradox. It doesn't let us go around what is difficult and what is hard and what is painful, which means if it reports that joy is still possible, it can be believed, I think, maybe. And I think Scripture's like that, too. Mm-hmm. We would like to get some of these messy, nasty stories out of Scripture, but they happen. If it's if there's good news, if it's going to be in a world where this stuff happens, and the psalmists talk about it. What's stirring around out here? Yeah, Kathy.
I just wanted to make one comment, and that is for anybody who does have difficulty with poetry, enjoying it, what I found was if you just sit there and read it out loud, it makes a huge difference to me. And I just wanted to make that suggestion to people.
That's really good. I'll give you a second, and then you go, because it's an advertisement. Pádraig Ó'Tuama, who's our preacher on Wednesday and Wednesday night, has a poetry podcast, 15 minutes, called Poetry Unbound. He's another one that will help you read it out loud, like Kathy's talking about. And you might have access to poems you didn't think you did. What do you all think about that? Reading it aloud, audible.
Yeah, it's absolutely necessary. It started as a verbal, and it's moved on. But in poetry school, you know, doing it, every teacher always said, read it and then reread it out loud.
Any other questions? Well, we gave all of you a handout, and I think we can make it available electronically. If someone wants to send an email to us, we'll send it to the readings. And I would suggest, and Hal, I think you would agree, that you maybe take these and others and start your own little poetry file. But don't rush through this. Don't allow yourself to read all these poems in one sitting. Take one poem, maybe take it for a whole week and really dig into it and read it out loud, maybe put it to song, I don't know. But it would be really good to begin to own it rather than just read it and to participate in it as an experience. And it might take you to places where you'll begin to think in ways that you haven't been able to think before or feel.
Thank you, Bill. This has been great fun for us. Bill and I have spent time brainstorming this thing, and it's just been been good for our friendship and good for our brains.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, too, for this. This is terrific. This is just what Catherine had in mind, and I that we'd get to overhear some conversation. And as I mentioned, we set these forums up to kind of look forward to the week ahead in Lenten preaching. So Pádraig Ó'Tuama is coming on Wednesday. We thought it would be nice to have a conversation about poetry. We'll have, I believe next week might be Room in the Inn, folks. Sorry if I have my schedule wrong. The schedule's out there because we have Lisa's coming from Room in the Inn to preach at LPS. So the idea is to get our imagination started, and this was a great way to pray our way into a week with Pádraig Ó'Tuama. Hope you'll see it. He'll be with us this week. God bless you all.